You don't meet people by accident, and the person you're drawn to may not just be someone entering your life, but someone revealing the parts of you you've never fully faced. Before anything changes in your external life, before marriage, before relocation, before any visible turning point, something far more significant already begins shifting inside you. And if you're observant, you can sense it. A quiet restlessness, a feeling that the version of you that got you here is no longer enough for where life is pulling you next. This isn't confusion. It isn't emotional instability. It's preparation. What many people describe as spiritual signs or messages from beyond can also be understood in a deeper psychological way as movements within the unconscious mind. Carl Jung pointed out that the psyche is never still or passive. It is always working toward wholeness, constantly pushing us toward integration. And when a major transition is approaching, whether it's a lifelong relationship or a complete shift in environment, the inner world begins adjusting long before anything changes outside. You may start noticing subtle things. Certain people feel less aligned than they used to. Conversations that once felt meaningful now feel flat. Old habits lose their hold without any effort on your part. It can feel unsettling, like familiar ground is quietly disappearing before new ground has appeared. But that is exactly how transformation works. It doesn't wait for permission. It asks for participation. This inner change isn't about becoming someone completely different. It's about becoming more fully yourself. Over time, we build identities shaped by family expectations, social roles, past wounds, and survival patterns. These identities help us function, but they don't represent the full truth of who we are. And when something real and significant is approaching, especially a deep emotional connection, those partial identities start to break down. They can't carry the weight of what's coming, so they begin to dissolve. What follows is a kind of internal reorganization. The psyche starts sorting itself out, bringing forward what is authentic and letting go of what is false or no longer needed. That's why it often feels like loss before it feels like growth. You are not being stripped away from yourself. You are shedding layers that were never meant to define you permanently. And this process isn't random. It's highly precise. What begins to emerge, greater emotional awareness, honesty with yourself, a deeper need for truth, are the exact qualities required for a meaningful relationship. Because real connection cannot survive on performance or illusion. It requires presence. It requires emotional clarity. It requires you to meet another person as you are, not as a version you constructed. In that sense, marriage or union is not the starting point of transformation. It is the outcome of it. The external relationship mirrors the internal one. The more integrated you become within yourself, the more naturally you are drawn towards someone who matches that level of integration. That's why timing matters, not in the way we want it to, but in the way we're actually ready for it. Not when desire is strongest, but when stability inside you is strong enough to hold it. So if you're in a phase of uncertainty, where clarity feels just out of reach, it may not be confusion at all. It may be alignment in progress. You are not being delayed. You are being prepared. The discomfort is not proof that something is wrong. It is often evidence that something real is forming underneath the surface. And the most important part of this entire process is trust, not blind optimism, but a grounded trust in your own inner development. A recognition that every emotional shift, every moment of doubt, every quiet realization is part of a larger pattern unfolding with purpose, even if you cannot fully see it yet. Because when the outer moment finally arrives, when the opportunity, the person, or the change appears, it won't feel forced or chaotic. It will feel natural, almost inevitable. Not because it was rushed into existence, but because you have already become the person who can meet it. So the question slowly shifts. It's no longer, when will this happen, but rather, who am I becoming while I wait? Because that answer shapes everything. And if you can stay present through that inner unfolding, if you allow the old versions of you to fall away without resistance, then you are not just approaching a new chapter of life. You are becoming someone capable of living it fully. And that is where the real beginning actually is. If you look closely at your experience, you may also notice something else. Meaningful change rarely begins with words. The most important messages in life are often felt before they are understood. Before anything is spoken clearly, something is already unfolding beneath conscious awareness, a subtle inner dialogue that is easy to miss, but hard to ignore once you notice it. From a psychological point of view, this is not mystical in a superficial sense. It reflects how the unconscious mind communicates. Carl Jung described this through the idea of symbols and synchronicities, meaningful patterns and coincidences that don't follow strict logic, yet feel deeply significant to the person experiencing them. You may notice a growing sense that something is coming, even if you can't explain why. Repeated themes might show up in your environment. Thoughts about partnership, commitment, or emotional connection may surface more often than usual. Even dreams can carry a stronger emotional weight. These are not random. They are patterns forming in awareness. But the unconscious doesn't speak in direct sentences. It doesn't give clear instructions. It communicates through impressions, feelings, and repetition. And if you wait for absolute certainty before acknowledging it, you may miss what is already being shown in subtle form. At the same time, the rational mind naturally pushes back. It asks for proof. It demands clear evidence. It wants certainty before it accepts meaning. And that tension between inner knowing and external proof is often where the deeper process begins to unfold. And while skepticism has its place, it can become limiting when it starts rejecting everything that hasn't yet been measured or fully explained. The unconscious mind doesn't operate within the boundaries of strict logic. It follows a different kind of order, one that is symbolic, emotional, and deeply patterned. Engaging with it requires a different mode of awareness, one that is receptive rather than purely analytical. This is where intuition begins to matter. Not as impulsive guessing or vague emotion, but as a sharpened sensitivity to patterns, both internal and external. It is the ability to notice coherence where others only see randomness, and to sense meaning forming before it becomes fully clear in words. Within the context of deep human connection, this intuitive layer often becomes the first point of contact between two people. What feels like a sudden pull toward someone is not only emotional attraction. It can also be a form of resonance, an alignment between psychological patterns, lived experiences, values, and unconscious material that is moving toward integration. In simple terms, you are often drawn to what reflects something essential within you. And that recognition doesn't always begin at the conscious level. It starts underneath awareness, long before any real interaction takes place. That is why certain connections feel strangely familiar even when they are new. There is an internal sense of recognition, as if something already understood is now appearing in physical form. Not because you have lived it before in the literal sense, but because it matches something that has already been developing within your inner world. The outer experience doesn't create that feeling. It activates it. At the same time, this process requires discernment. Not every coincidence carries meaning, and not every emotional reaction is a signal of something deeper. The key is not to assign significance too quickly, but to observe patterns over time. Genuine inner signals tend to repeat, to echo in different forms, and to bring a sense of clarity rather than confusion. They don't force action, they invite attention. And at this stage, perhaps the most important shift is learning how to listen, not only to external information, but to internal movement as well. To notice subtle changes in perception, shifts in emotional response, and the quiet but consistent direction of your inner life. Because what is being revealed is not separate from you. It is being recognized through you. When the moment of direct communication eventually arrives, when words are finally spoken and intentions are made clear, it will not feel like something completely new. It will feel like confirmation, like the outer world catching up to something your inner world has already been registering for some time. So instead of searching only for external certainty, it may be worth considering that the process has already begun in a quieter form. That what you are sensing is not imagination, but early awareness taking shape. And that clarity is less about receiving a message and more about being able to perceive what is already unfolding. Because the most important signals in life rarely announce themselves loudly. They reveal themselves gradually to those willing to notice. And the real question is not whether something is being communicated, but whether you are ready to recognize it. At a certain point, the idea of relocation stops being just a practical decision and begins to feel symbolic. On the surface, it may look like a change of environment, another city, another space, another routine. But internally, it often reflects something much deeper, a shift in identity, a movement from who you were toward who you are becoming. This is why such transitions can feel unusually weighty. You are not only changing where you live, you are moving through layers of your own psychology. Carl Jung described this broader unfolding as individuation, the gradual process of becoming more fully yourself by moving beyond socially imposed roles, expectations, and inherited identities. Most people, without realizing it, remain anchored in environments that continuously reinforce older versions of who they are. Familiar places, routines, and relationships can act like psychological reinforcement loops. They stabilize identity, but they can also limit expansion. But when an internal transformation begins, especially one tied to emotional depth or life-defining connection, those same environments may start to feel constraining. Not because the outside world has changed, but because you have. What once felt comfortable may begin to feel stagnant. What once felt familiar may begin to feel limiting. And over time, this creates an inner tension that cannot be resolved by staying still. In that sense, relocation becomes more than movement. It becomes realignment. A way for the psyche to create space for a new version of life to emerge without constantly being pulled back into old patterns. A new environment offers something important: psychological neutrality. Fewer assumptions. Fewer reminders of past identities. A kind of reset point where a different version of you can begin to take shape more freely. That is also why relocation often brings mixed emotions. Excitement exists alongside uncertainty. Possibility exists alongside disorientation. The familiar reference points that once defined you begin to disappear. And with them comes a deeper question. Who are you without them? But that question is not meant to destabilize you. It is meant to free you. Because when external definitions fall away, you are left with something more fundamental: your actual internal direction. The part of you that is not dependent on environment or expectation, but that has been quietly forming beneath everything else. And this is where alignment begins to matter. Places are not psychologically neutral in how they affect us. Different environments activate different aspects of the self. Some reinforce stagnation, others encourage growth. And when you are aligned internally, you naturally begin to move toward spaces that support that evolution. In the context of meaningful connection, this becomes even more relevant. The environments two people move toward are often not random. They reflect shared direction, shared timing, and shared readiness for a new phase of life to unfold. Of course, it is easy to reduce relocation to logistics, planning, and uncertainty, and those elements are real, but they are not the whole picture. If you focus only on practical concerns, you miss the deeper psychological movement happening underneath. Because this is not just about changing location, it is about changing configuration. Not displacement, but repositioning. And the more consciously you engage with that process, the clearer it becomes that the destination is not only a place on a map, it is a reflection of internal development finally becoming visible in the outer world. So when movement begins, whether gradual or sudden, the deeper question is not simply where you are going. It is what version of you is finally ready to arrive there. It is the moment where something has to end, not slowly dissolve, not linger in a half-present state, but reach a clear and undeniable conclusion. And yet, without this kind of ending, nothing genuinely new can take shape. This isn't just a poetic notion, it is a psychological requirement. When we talk about transformation, especially one tied to emotional depth or a shift in life direction, we are also talking about the removal of what no longer fits. Carl Jung observed that the psyche moves toward wholeness, but it cannot do so by simply layering new experiences over old, unresolved patterns. At a certain point, something has to be released so something more coherent can emerge. That is why, during major inner transitions, life often begins to present experiences that feel like closures. Relationships that once felt meaningful start to lose their emotional weight. Habits that once defined your rhythm no longer feel natural. Even long-held beliefs about who you are begin to feel slightly off, as if they belong to an earlier version of you. This is not collapse, it is restructuring. But endings rarely feel clean or comfortable. They disrupt continuity. They challenge the story you've built about your life, and most importantly, they place you in a space of uncertainty. Because when something ends, there is always a phase, sometimes brief, sometimes extended, where what was is gone, and what will be has not yet formed. That in-between space is often interpreted as loss. And in one sense, it is. Something real is no longer present. But what is often missed is that this space is not empty. It is open. It has been cleared, intentionally or through circumstance, to allow something more aligned with your current state of development to emerge. The difficulty is that most people try to rush through this space. They immediately fill it with something familiar just to avoid discomfort. But that impulse can interrupt the very process that is unfolding. Because what you quickly replace, you often unconsciously recreate. There is a certain discipline required here. The ability to let an ending be fully complete. Not to deny it, not to cling to it, but to let it finish its cycle without interference. That also means acknowledging what it meant, what role it played, what it revealed about your attachments, your patterns, and your direction. Every ending carries information. If you approach it consciously, it stops being confusion and becomes clarity. You begin to see not only that something is ending, but why it cannot continue in its previous form. And there is a difference between forced endings and natural ones. Forced endings tend to feel abrupt, reactive, and fragmented. They often leave behind emotional residue because they are driven by avoidance or resistance. Natural endings, however, carry a different quality. Even if they are painful, they feel internally coherent. There is a quiet recognition that continuation is no longer aligned with something essential. It is these natural conclusions that create space for meaningful beginnings. Because what follows is not driven by loss, but by alignment. You are not moving forward simply because something disappeared. You are moving because something in you has shifted. In the context of deeper relationships or life transitions, this becomes especially important. You cannot carry outdated emotional structures into a space that requires presence, honesty, and integration. Anything unresolved will eventually surface, not as punishment, but as exposure, which is why the ending is not separate from the beginning. It is part of it. So when a closure appears in your life, whether in a relationship, a role, or even an identity you once held, there is another way to interpret it, not only as something being taken away, but as something being cleared out, not as disruption, but as preparation. Because transformation is not about accumulation, it is about refinement, removing what is unnecessary so what is essential can finally be seen. And if you allow an ending to fully complete without rushing to replace it, you create the conditions for something far more stable and coherent to emerge. What you release determines what you are able to hold. And the real question is not what you are losing, but what space is finally being made available within you. When the idea of marriage enters this framework, it is often seen as a final destination, the point where uncertainty ends and stability begins. But psychologically, that view is incomplete. What you are actually entering is not an endpoint, but a reflection, a mirror, a living structure that reflects who you are at a deeper level, not only your strengths, but also your contradictions, your unresolved fears, and the parts of yourself you may have avoided confronting. This is why meaningful relationships can feel both deeply comforting and unexpectedly challenging. On one level, there is recognition, a sense of being seen in a way that feels natural and immediate. But alongside that recognition comes exposure. Patterns you thought you had outgrown begin to reappear. Emotional responses you assumed were resolved return, sometimes quietly, sometimes insistently. This isn't a failure of the relationship. It is, in fact, a sign of its depth. Carl Jung emphasized that we never meet others in a purely objective way. Every encounter is filtered through the psyche, through internal structures formed long before the relationship even begins. We don't just see people as they are, we also see them through what we carry within us. We project, we interpret, and we respond based on patterns that often operate beneath awareness. In surface-level connections, those projections can remain largely untouched. There is not enough emotional depth or psychological pressure for them to be questioned. But in a deeper bond, that changes. The relationship begins to bring those hidden layers to the surface. This is where the idea of the partner as a mirror becomes important. The person you feel drawn to is rarely random in the psychological sense. They tend to resonate with something already active within your inner world. Sometimes qualities you consciously admire and want to strengthen, and other times traits that create discomfort because they touch areas you have not fully resolved within yourself. This dynamic is often misunderstood. It becomes easy to assume that emotional intensity, tension, or conflict means incompatibility. But in many meaningful relationships, these moments are not signs of something going wrong. They are signs that something is being revealed. The relationship is not failing its purpose, it is fulfilling it. Rather than existing as a space of constant comfort, a deeper connection becomes a space of awareness. It brings forward what would otherwise remain unconscious,
making it visible through interaction, emotion, and reaction.
The real challenge is not to eliminate these reflections, but to engage with them consciously. To recognize that your emotional responses are not only about the other person, but also about what is being activated within you. That requires a level of responsibility that goes beyond surface communication. It asks for self-inquiry, honesty, and a willingness to stay present even when it is uncomfortable. At the same time, this process is mutual. Just as your partner reflects aspects of you, you also reflect aspects of them. The relationship becomes a shared psychological space where both individuals are invited into growth, not separately, but through each other. In this sense, there is a critical difference between projection and perception. Projection is when you unconsciously assign your inner material to the other person, treating it as if it originates from them. Perception is when you begin to see more clearly, recognizing the other person as they are, while also acknowledging your own internal contribution to the experience. In this sense, marriage is not about finding someone who completes you. It is about encountering someone who reveals what still needs to be integrated within you. The relationship does not erase complexity. It exposes it. And through that exposure, it creates the possibility of integration, where different parts of the self are gradually brought into alignment through awareness and experience. And if you are willing to meet that reflection consciously instead of defensively, the relationship becomes something more than emotional connection. It becomes a process of transformation. In the end, the depth of your relationship will not be defined by how well you avoid your inner complexity, but by how honestly you are willing to face it. And the person beside you may not just be your partner. They may be the clearest mirror you will ever encounter. And if you stay present with that mirror, instead of resisting it, you don't just build a relationship, you become someone capable of holding a deeper one with both the other person and yourself.